let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kathleen O'Hara, as Sam told you, and I've been a victim service provider for the past 18 years, working with mainly survivors of homicide in their families, and again, working at the UN and the U.S. Department of Justice, as well as Victim Support Europe. And this subject, I really think, is so important because it's an unseen problem. And I just wanted to, before I introduced our esteemed guests, there was an article in the Sunday Times about rescued slaves abandoned as abusers go free. And I just want to read one little part. The report that was published by a cross-party committee of MPs said, published today, lambasted the government for an inexcusable and shocking lack of support for rescued slaves. Even when victims of trafficking manage to get away from their captors, many are taken back into slavery. Rescued slaves are often reduced to destitution while their abusers go free, according to the inquiry by the Work and Pensions Select Committee. With weak and uncoordinated frontline services and an appalling lack of gangmaster convictions. So I'll just leave you with that. And go directly to introducing my guests, who will really educate us on what they're doing and what the problem is. So we have Andrew Wallace, we've got Eileen Walsh, and we've got Tamara Barnett, and we're going to start with Andrew, who's going to tell us about his organization.
Good morning. I just want to sort of put some context into what we're talking about. So I'm just going to show you a little video which just highlights the indicators and the possible scenarios, predominantly in a UK context, that we find modern slavery at the moment. Sorry. Change the money.
Thank you, Andrew.
So that sets the context of what we're talking about in the UK. I'm going to hand off to Tamara first, and then we'll come back to me, because I'm only good in little doses.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very powerful video. So, I mean, to jump from that, just talking briefly about my organisation. I'm Tamara and I work for the Human Trafficking Foundation. We don't actually do frontline work. Our background is that we were set up by Claire Short and Anthony Steen, Baroness Butler-Sloss, who were two former MPs and someone in the House of Lords. And we came out of the all-party parliamentary group. And we still very much try and play a role of kind of seeing ourselves as trying to ensure that NGO sector has a voice with parliamentarians. We're also now doing more work in sort of local government. We also try to stop people working in silos. So we have a huge national sort of advisory forum, which anyone is welcome to attend. If anyone's interested, just let me know. You're also very welcome to attend. The particular projects that I work on, I lead the European Parliamentary project, which is where we work with European parliaments, try and raise awareness there in terms of what they can do in terms of creating subcommittees, and obviously the Modern Slavery Act is a kind of best practice example of legislation, though it has its faults, as we will sort of discuss later. I also run the London project, which is where we're specifically now starting to look at local authorities and how we can assist them. As part of that work, I now have a London working group of sort of frontline experts who work in London. So we really try to sort of work together and work with the councils and try and support them and try and, again, create this pan-London work, because there's lots of really good practice, there's lots of really good little services that people don't know about, and it's just trying to connect the dots. So we very much try to do that. Another part of that work is trying to create, looking into sort of long-term support. We don't do any frontline services, but we're trying to connect lots of organisations to create some long-term support work in London, which is something, again, I've sort of discussed with Sam about the fact that we're looking at people who can potentially provide victims with potential jobs, potential housing, long-term support. You talked about this article. We actually sort of helped put that article together. I think my chair's quoted in that, and the case example is also from us. So we try and sort of do a lot of lobbying to highlight some of the key concerns, and one of our key concerns is the complete lack of support for survivors, and that article sort of really powerfully portrays that. So I'm going to just sort of highlight sort of three key areas that we sort of have particular concerns about, particularly in terms of the London work that we're doing. So one is identification. That video beautifully shows how it really is these subtle little signs. What if someone's doing building work, why are they wearing flip-flops in winter, kind of thing. It's just noticing those little things that you might forget to notice. But what the real concern for us in terms of our work we're doing in London is that now there's an actual statutory duty to report. And what we're finding is that the level of reporting, particularly among local authorities, social services, is really, really low. And surveys still show that about 60% of social workers think that you have to cross an international border to be trafficked. There was a TV show a few years ago called Made in Mayfair, which was sort of a play on, I don't know if you know, Made in Chelsea, sort of reality TV. And they were following several people who lived in Mayfair, including a GP. And he was interviewing a victim of trafficking, but he didn't describe her as that, and he didn't recognise it as a concern. He said he was talking to her in Hindi, and then he turns to the camera and he says, "This woman's just told me that her bosses keep her passport and they hardly ever let her out." And he said, "I see this a lot." And it went back to the story, as this was like an exciting little part of Made in Mayfair. This is alarming. This was potentially a case of quite serious, certainly on the spectrum, but very likely to be an example of slavery. So people are even when people are identifying it, they're not actually seeing how serious it is. And there's this thing that we say in the sector that it's a bit like domestic violence 25 years ago. We don't really recognise it as a serious crime. It's not identified in this right way. And certainly domestic violence is not sorted. So I know people who are working in those sectors might be like, this is not, it's not an ideal world for victims of domestic violence. But I think in terms of modern slavery, we're really behind, and we're really only just beginning to realise. And I hope it's sort of in 10, 20 years we'll have that kind of sensitivity that we do to domestic violence now, indicators and the risks and what the implications are. I think one of the broader issues that we always try to push is that victims of trafficking are not what you expect. It's always what you're not reading in the Sunday Times. It's everything that you don't expect it to be. So, I mean, people used to think that all victims were migrants. I don't know if you've seen the data in the last year, but the highest group for children was from Britain, according to the data. So British children are the biggest victim group that we're finding anyway at the moment. People always thought it was about sex trafficking. Obviously, that was something that the media were particularly interested in for obvious reasons. In fact, the data again now is showing that labour trafficking is possibly higher than sex trafficking in terms of the cases we're seeing in the UK and across the world. Again, particularly abroad, people find it very hard to recognise things out besides sex trafficking because it's the most obvious one in people's minds in terms of exploitation. Also, people imagine it must be women and children. People find it very hard to see adult males as people who are vulnerable. In fact, they can potentially some of the most vulnerable people, and some of the most vulnerable cases certainly that we have read about and seen. And it's also thinking about what's not in the data. So we've heard about, about the Rochdale cases maybe. These were British girls not being exploited in brothels. They're exploited in B&Bs, in people's houses. These were horrendous cases of very young British girls being abused. But I'd say always think, what are we not reading about? What's not in the data? So what about British boys? We've heard that British boys are being exploited in similar ways. They maybe find a boyfriend online, and then they start to be exploited by his friends. And we've heard again that social services are rejecting it as a lifestyle choice. Similarly, we're starting to understand, obviously, Vietnamese boys in cannabis farms. That's quite a well-known case. You might have seen and read about it. Sort of quite young, sort of teenage boys or girls being made to sort of tend cannabis in these kind of enclosed houses across the UK. But yet, although we're beginning to hear that actually police are identifying that, there's similar cases with British boys, for example, in gangs being exploited by older men for drug running, for example. Again, all those boys are still being criminalised. So although we're beginning to understand it when it's migrant cases, why are we not recognising it, for example, when it's basically exactly the same thing, but it's just British children? So it is really about thinking about what are we not thinking about? Lots of different people are vulnerable. So this was just it's a general summary of what human trafficking is. I think the interesting bit for me that I just want to pull out is at the bottom, and the fact that it's in so many other ordinary bits of business, if you like. So if there's a house full of if it's a house with 4 people and there's 12 people living in it, that's possibly a sign that these people are being exploited. If someone's gone missing, why have they gone missing? Are they just someone who's not happy at home, or is there something else going on? Benefit for it, again, a lot of people, we've heard about domestic violence cases which were labelled as domestic violence, but in fact, the person didn't even know the name of their husband, they didn't even know their ethnicity. So there's sham marriages, there's all sorts of complexities, which mean that human trafficking is just part of all the other criminality and issues you're seeing on the everyday. So the second issue, which is something that the Human Trafficking Foundation is probably one of our priority areas at the moment, is the lack of long-term support for adults. So at the moment, you may not be aware, but the government provides safe houses for victims of trafficking if they are identified and are willing to go into the NRM. That's actually a very big step, but we'll discuss that later, if they actually have the trust to go into the system. But if they do go in the system, there's an assumption that means something for the victims of trafficking, but at the moment, it has no meaning at all for them. It literally means you are going to get some short-term support. But after that so-called 45 days, on average it's more about 90 days, they're either told, oh yes, we recognise you as trafficked, and you have 2 weeks to leave, or they say, oh no, actually, not enough evidence, we don't think you are trafficked, and you have 2 days to leave. And there's nothing else. There's nothing in place at all. It's a postcode lottery in terms of what the NGOs are out there. If you're maybe a female and you're in Sheffield, there's Snowdrop, but in most, for example, parts of the UK, particularly in London, there's certainly nothing for adult male victims at all. What we're seeing, and we talk about that case in that article, we've seen several cases where people are being re-trafficked. They're leaving the safe house, they're getting re-trafficked and going back into safe houses again. So it's a complete waste of money for everybody, as well as just the horrendous sort of human aspect of the situation. So that's just me trying to explain how the NRM works. So someone's identified, they go into the system. It's probably perhaps not particularly relevant to everyone here, but it's a system that we think is sort of disjointed and doesn't really work. And this just summarised where in the last year where victims of trafficking ended up after they left a safe house. You'll see most of them apparently end up living with friends, which is quite unusual, because we think, particularly with migrant cases, it's unlikely to have many friends. That's probably how the situation escalated in the way it did. And certainly we've had, because we come up, I think, quite high on Google, even though we're not a frontline service, we had someone several months ago who rang up and she had leave to remain, and she was recognised as a victim of trafficking. She'd been in a safe house. She hadn't been allowed to be put into asylum, so she hadn't gone into asylum accommodation. So she was homeless, and the council wasn't giving her housing. And she'd found a friend. She'd found a man selling vegetables on the street, and she'd gone to live with him and some of his friends, but she clearly didn't feel safe, which is why she was ringing us. And you're just thinking, this woman has all the indicators that she's going to be exploited again. So our final area of concern is children. So at the moment, whereas adults go into this government-funded safe house for a short period, it's assumed that children are a safeguarding issue. They fit under the Children's Act, so it's assumed local authorities will kind of take care of them if they're identified. One of the problems we're finding is that some children might be perfectly okay under the system as it is, but actually a lot of them need some certain specialist support that maybe people who aren't victims of trafficking don't need. So they might need to have their phones taken away. They might need to be kept in during the week. There's lots of sort of things that put them at risk, and we know there's a very good report that came out last year from iCAAD UK and Missing Persons, which showed that huge numbers of children go missing. Trafficked children are often told to leave by their traffickers, for example, or they're vulnerable and they're looking for someone and they're easily exploited. So we're very keen to push for children to have specialist support. I'm not sure my slides are all over the place here, so I'm not sure what the next thing is, but I think this is just a slide explaining why it's important for the children to also be recognised by the government system, the NRM, National Referral Mechanism. Because local authorities don't think it matters in a way because it doesn't give them any housing in the way it does for adults. But this is just a list of things that actually show that it is very important for children to go into the NRM. It does provide them potentially with legal aid access, and there's a whole series of reasons up there. But I don't know, again, in terms of audience, how relevant that particularly is. That this slide was for local authorities to try and convince them why they should be recognising children as being trafficked and then using the NRM. I think that is the final slide, yes. So that's a quick summary. Later we're going to talk about some of the solutions, and there's a whole series of other problems that we have concerns about, but I think this kind of summarises some of the chief areas we're particularly looking at in London.
Great. Thank you, Tamara. Eileen?
So hello. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the psychological consequences of different aspects of modern slavery. I work at the Helen Bamber Foundation, and this is an NGO that works with what's described as survivors of human cruelty. So I guess it's a sort of quite a broad term, but many of the people that we work with are victims of trafficking who've been exploited. The people that we have directly worked with have had a variety of different forms of exploitation, and we offer a model of integrated care. So in addition to psychological assessment and treatment, if people want that, we also have a counter-trafficking program. We have a medical advisory clinic. We have some legal advisors who link people up with a solicitor if they need that. We also offer help for people with welfare and housing, and then some additional sort of groups such as English classes, computer classes. We offer yoga, and then some sort of interests such as photography, knitting, that type of thing. So it's quite a wide range of things that we offer, and within that there is the psychological assessment and therapy. So the clients that we see, what do they report? So a lot of people report symptoms that we might associate, say, with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of people experience nightmares, flashbacks, where they relive or re-experience the traumatic events that they've undergone. A lot of people have very big problems with negative emotions, maybe directly in response to having a flashback or a nightmare. Or it can be simply that they carry a lot of these difficult feelings related to their circumstances now. So a lot of people describe having a constant sense of danger. And this I think slightly depends on people's perception of any future risk to them, but I think people can carry that feeling even if perhaps there's no reason to believe that anyone who exploited them is anywhere nearby or is even in the UK. A lot of people have feelings such as shame and guilt and self-blame, and of course part of the psychological abuse involved in some forms of exploitation sort of manipulates people to feel responsible for their own experiences. And we see this with the people that we work with maybe many years after they have their exploitation experience has ended, where they continue to blame themselves for things that we might regard were completely beyond their control. A lot of people have coped with their memories by avoiding thinking about, trying to avoid feelings, trying to avoid any reminders of what's happened. A lot of people have symptoms of hypervigilance, where they feel on guard all of the time. And some people kind of go to quite elaborate lengths to try and feel as safe as possible, maybe really limiting their social activity, avoiding meeting new people, avoiding going out. A lot of people avoid people from the same country as them if they associate that with their trafficking experience. And I suppose one of the biggest and most difficult things to work with really is a lot of people find that they have a change in their perception of themselves. And when I've written loss of confidence, it's a little bit of an understatement, but I suppose just a change in their own sense of who they are in the world. I've listed a few more common problems. I think one of the key ones for me is the sort of lack of agency, feeling very helpless. And I think a lot of people that we encounter who have been exploited in this way, they might not ask for help. The difficulties with trust can really affect people's engagement with authorities, people's engagement with any type of help that they are offered. And some of the people we see have great difficulties with keeping safe now, and I think this is kind of related to some of what Tamara had said about the sort of what circumstances do we end up putting people in perhaps after they have been offered maybe a safe house, and do they, a lot of people we've worked with perhaps have gone to live with friends who turned out perhaps to be people who would end up exploiting them or ended up accessing other people who exploited them. I think another thing is many people might not identify as a victim. A lot of people that have, I suppose, some of the factors that make people vulnerable to being trafficked may also be features of their whole life. I mean, some of the people I've worked with, they've never had much choice. They've never had an opportunity to live a life in the way that we might expect to live our lives. Many people have been in some form of servitude from early childhood, and their sense of what they should be able to expect from life, it might be very different from a person who perhaps has had a reasonably good life until maybe being trafficked as an older person. So this is just some of the comments that some of the people I've worked with have said related to their own experiences. I think probably one of the most common ones is feeling scared, and I think that's one of the ways that people are controlled. I felt scared all the time. I forgot how to think. I felt like an animal, and people talk about sort of, this was one particular lady who talked about being forced to drink a lot of alcohol during her experiences as a way of, I think, the way of controlling her. And then she said afterwards it was so difficult to reflect back because she had drank and then she had sort of been laughing and having what might have appeared like fun, and this was a very, very humiliating memory for her. Some of the psychological abuse, I think, is reflected in the next comment. He brought me out for dinner on my birthday, and that made me feel more confused. This was a lady who was in forced prostitution and the perpetrator was a man who had initially posed as a romantic partner, and there was this sort of flipping between, oh, it's your birthday, let's go out, you love Italian food, and bringing her out for Italian food, but then later on that night her having to go back to the forced prostitution that she was working in. not working and being forced to engage in. This last comment is a lady who had been trafficked and was forced to sell DVDs on the street. And she said it took her a long time to realise why she ended up being so stuck in it, that the traffickers had arranged for people to rob her of the DVDs every week. And she thought she had tremendous bad luck that she kept being robbed, and she had to pay the traffickers then for the lost merchandise, and was never able to accumulate savings. And she spent about 10 years in this situation, and it took a very long time for her to, because she was isolated so much, it took her a very long time to realise that this was not a coincidence. And this for her was the most disturbing thing. When I was working with her, we were working through an interpreter, and I might ask a question and I would say DVD, and she would have a flashback with the name of that word. So this is a what are the risk factors for people who are trafficked developing mental health problems? So this is from a systematic review by one of my colleagues, and there was these particular indicators that made it more likely that people who had been trafficked and exploited would develop mental health problems. So violence, poor living and working conditions, restricted movement, longer duration of exploitation, and unmet social needs after escape. And I guess the unmet social needs taps in a little bit to what we're providing here, and the gaps in the services that we perhaps should be providing to really meet people's needs. So research studies on mental health, the most common, I suppose, diagnosable problems that have been found in these studies have been post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly if people have been exploited in ways where violence has been a feature. Violence, including sexual violence, has been a feature of the exploitation. Symptoms of depression and anxiety. This study looked at people who had been trafficked and then returned to Moldova, and most of those women had been in sexual exploitation. And over 50% of them, after return, met at least one diagnostic criteria for at least one mental health problem. Development of mental health problems, of course, is related to pre-migration events as well as trafficking-related experience, and also the stressors that people have post-migration. So in terms of substance misuse, the data is not conclusive. A large-scale study by Ora et al. Found that there was a very low level of self-reported substance misuse, but the highest area of missing data they reported in their study related to substance misuse. I think from clinical practice, I would say that we have observed substance misuse as being a feature in certain circumstances. I think it's certainly part of the picture of vulnerability pre-trafficking. A lot of the women I've worked with who have been trafficked for forced prostitution had reported that their father had an alcohol problem, and this affected the family economics a lot, which added to their vulnerability. Some people had their own substance misuse problem prior to being trafficked, which made them more vulnerable. I think within the trafficking experience, some of the people we've worked with report having sort of forced alcohol and substance use while in the trafficking situation, and also voluntary as a way of coping with the very difficult circumstances. In labour exploitation, I think I'm particularly thinking here of people who've been in building work and other forms of forced labour, where they reported that it was so intolerable that when they weren't working, they would drink to excess in a way they may not have done before. This is our care programme. So we have a phased model of treatment with 3 main stages. This is based on a sort of a model devised by Judith Herman in her book Trauma and Recovery. So what we aim to do first of all is try to help people to feel a little bit safer, a bit more stable in terms of practical elements of their life, but also ways of managing some of the psychological symptoms they have. Then we move on to working particularly on the core part of treatment. I mean, I've given an example of, say, a post-traumatic stress treatment where we would go through memories in detail to assist the person in processing nightmares and flashbacks so that these events no longer trouble them in that same way. And then our final part of treatment is really about building a person's personal life again, building their relationships, work, study, and their personal interests. I was just going to briefly talk about Beatrice for one moment. I suppose she was from a West African country, had a good life, but there was a problem where her family wanted her to have FGM, and there was a very strong belief in the community that if she did not have this, that it would really damage her prospects for marriage and would make her more vulnerable perhaps to being hurt by others. But this was delayed because of the war, so she knew a lot about FGM by the time this came to be proposed, and she was very frightened. A friend had died, she knew it was supposed to be painful, and she decided to run away. She wasn't given help, unfortunately, in her local area. It was not illegal in the country she was living in at the time, and she ended up being very vulnerable, living on the streets, and it was in this context that she was trafficked, and she was trafficked to the UK. She was exploited in forced prostitution for over 5 years, and she was confined in a basement for most of that time. The only people she encountered were the trafficker and the people buying the service. She did escape eventually, but only when 9 months pregnant, when it became apparent to one of the men that this didn't seem quite right, and this person had said that he had thought she had been voluntarily engaging, but did help her to escape. So we went through, when we did our work together, we worked particularly on the nightmares and flashbacks that she had. And this was complicated by she had a very strong sense of anger with her parents for exposing her to the risk of trafficking, and as a result, even though it was several years later, she hadn't traced her family. She'd gone on and had children in a consensual relationship, but felt that would be nice for them to have extended family, but felt too angry with her parents to do this. And she felt that she'd lost all of the good memories in her life before then because of how she connected the parents to the trafficking. So I will try and wrap up. So in our work together, let me just show you. So we go through a lifeline. So we start with perhaps early memories in the person's life, and we go through the key traumatic events, systematically, allowing the person to talk about it in detail. We make a connection between the past and the present, enabling the person to talk about and process these memories, rather than continuing with the sort of trying to block out the memories, which we think is one of the features that perpetrates continues having the nightmares and flashbacks. Beatrice did well in treatment, and she went on to start doing a degree program and started to trace her family. Still waiting for the outcome of that, but yeah.
Thank you, Eileen. That was brilliant, and really thank you, all three of you, for bringing to light to us as clinicians this unseen problem. And and I was thinking how often just walking down the street on passing a construction site or anything, and who actually is being exploited, not to mention the trafficking and the slavery of slaves at home and being kept at Mayfair and so on. So it's an awful problem. Thank you for giving a human voice to that and letting me know more about it. So we're going to move on to some questions to the panelists, and then we'll leave time at the end. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions to ask them. And the first one is, what are the problems? And some of this, by the way, we may have covered, but you can now sort of bring it out more. What are the problems and challenges you see in modern slavery today? What are those challenges?
Should I go first?
Would you like to?
So I think context is everything to understanding the challenge. So here's a question: how many slaves worked for you? So my kids will say, well, there's 3 of us, so 3 work for you. So that's just the way it is. But let's just do a little quiz, or let's bring this up close and personal, because if you wear clothing and you eat food and you've got a smartphone or a tablet, computer like this, and you wear moisturizer, men and women, and you should, then probably already 40 to 60 slaves work for you in the global supply chains of the world. And you haven't really tried anything. You've just got out on with your everyday life. And that's because we live in this globalized, interconnected world. And so I think, I agree with everything that's been said so far this morning, but it's very easy to think it's a problem that's either over there or doesn't affect us and everything else. And we are all personally connected to this issue. And then when we talk about nail bars and car washes, what's behind, I think, a lot of the trade in modern slavery is the fact that it's a trade. It's an illicit trade in human beings that are commodified, and that creates a lot of the mental health issues because, and we see this as a frontline service provider, just that commodification of a human being has huge mental health impacts on that individual. But it's driven by the demand for cheap, whether that's cheap goods, cheap services, cheap labor, cheap sex, cheap organs. That's what drives this whole industry. And we have, because we have a world that's on the move now, we have a ready supply of cheap commodity that can be exploited. And within 500 meters of this hotel, I could point out to you just examples of potential modern day slavery that's occurring here, in nice Kensington and Chelsea. So that connects us to the issue, even before we think, what are the problems around that. And the first problem is you and me. Our Western lifestyle, drives a lot of this industry. The other issue is also context. Where have we come from? Let's just go back 10 years. We wouldn't be having this panel 10 years ago. This was a very minor specialist issue, and it was predominantly understood as it was a sexual exploitation issue. It was framed around the movement of Eastern Europeans from Eastern Europe to Western Europe with the collapse of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. And that's pretty much how the issue was understood. If you now look at the National Referral Mechanism statistics, we are pretty much on parity, men and women, in terms of victims. And actually forced labor is now higher than sexual exploitation in terms of where we find the most victims. Now that may be because of focus around that. The sexual exploitation figures remain pretty constant. They haven't, they're going to probably stick at around 50%. 5 years ago, again, this was still pretty much a sort of a sideshow issue, and then we had the Modern Slavery Act, and then we now have a Prime Minister. And we have this small window where we have a Prime Minister, depends what happens on June the 8th, that is focused on this issue and says, this is one of the biggest human rights issues. The problems are huge. And some of them are structural, and some of them need systemic solutions. At Unseen, we do 4 things, and I think that sort of enables us to sort of identify some of the problems. So we are a frontline service provider, so we provide support services to men and women, and we will start offering the UK's first support and accommodation service for kids this summer. And we, for our wisdom, or is it our foolishness, we're never quite sure, we take the most traumatic and difficult cases. So when an adult enters the National Referral Mechanism, there should be a risk assessment done on 2 categories. What's their risk in terms of to themselves, because of the trauma that they suffered, and what's their risk from traffickers? And if they tick high on both, we tend to get them. Or as we joke within the Salvation Army contract, we get the ones that nobody else wants. And what that shows is, and Tamara was right to recognise it, is that during the NRM, it isn't really about recovery. It's called a recovery period, it isn't. What we're trying to establish is identity and whether they're a victim of a crime. And that takes about 90 to 100 days. And so you have a situation of someone that's falling down a cliff, we give them a safety net for 100 days, and then we take it away. And so out of that, we had to also develop a reintegration service, which is to say, actually, we have to take someone from being a position of a victim and incredibly vulnerable, and what is the journey to resilience? And in the UK, we've got it the wrong way around. And we have to start thinking about what is the journey to resilience.
Great.
You're
Thank
looking
you.
at me, so I'm going to stop. I've got one of those.
Your
ones.
3 minutes are up.
Yeah.
Eileen, would you like to comment on that?
I think from in terms of, say, a psychological perspective, I think probably a couple of the things I've found most difficult, I think, is the lack of aftercare for people. But I think also the sort of lack of, the lack of justice, there's a lot of research that talks about the sort of benefits of seeing justice, say, for example, if people have been tortured. And there's a whole organisation, Redress, a charity that assists people who've been tortured in other countries to get some form of redress. And I feel that there's so much potential for some of the people I work with, for there to be much greater efforts made at prosecuting, at securing convictions, and it just doesn't seem to happen. I have never worked with any woman or man who's been trafficked where their trafficker has been prosecuted. And there's a small amount of people perhaps who've been successful in maybe a civil claim, which can have a lot of meaning as well. But it's an outrage, really. I remember one lady I worked with who said, when she saw the television program or on the news about the girls in Ohio who had been held by this man for many years and were finally rescued. And she said that, it was worldwide news, everybody was horrified but kind of delighted that the girls were alive. And she said that she thought when she was rescued from her trafficking situation that it would be worldwide news because she had been held in slavery for so long. And she said, and actually I wasn't even believed. And it was only when she had to go to an appeal hearing that she won her case for asylum. And it just seems incredible to me, So I think that lack of being able to see justice, that sense of lack of fairness, I think is one of the most difficult things in terms of psychological recovery.
Good point.
It's so much has been said, and I think at that point of the lack of justice, but also what that also implicates is the lack of compensation. So these are people who've been working unpaid, possibly for years, and it's not that they suddenly get the whole compensation and get to see that wealth forever. We know that most victims of trafficking don't get any compensation at all. So there's huge injustice, so many aspects, and I think you put it so beautifully. Certainly in terms of looking at sort of particular origins, in terms of what we know is this lack of support that obviously the government needs to step up its game on, but at the moment it isn't. So in terms of where that places all of us, it is about looking at, as I mentioned before, there's no real long-term support provisions for male victims of trafficking. It's again looking into should we be looking into what kind of housing we could potentially provide for very vulnerable male survivors. Again, mental health support. That I think getting good legal advice and getting good mental health support, these are two really difficult things that victims of trafficking, particularly if they don't have a caseworker, will not get. And if they do have a caseworker, it's still very difficult to get. So if you are all sort of working in mental health, which presumably some of you are, is there a way maybe where you're working could work with some of the NGOs or safe houses to have sort of quick pathways for these highly vulnerable people who particularly need help, particularly because they're vulnerable of being re-trafficked due to all these conditions. So again, they really should be prioritised in a way that we're not at the moment seeing. So in terms of sort of, I think that's certainly one of the gaps, the lack of sort of mental health support. Helen Bamber have a huge waiting list because they are sort of best practice and brilliant, but there's only one of them. So it's impossible. We need more of that, more of what they're doing. And so I think in terms of the audience today, I'd say sort of mental health gap is definitely one we could look at.
It would seem so. The scope of the problems. Sorry.
But can I just come with that?
Yeah.
And this is just a perception from the front line of what we found, and this is just sort of, you discover things over a number of years of working with victims, is that during the NRM process, so during that process where the government is making a decision as to whether or not the person is a victim, that's the wrong time to do counselling. There's just so many other things that are going on. They've got to interact with police, potentially UK visas and immigration, with legal, with this and this. And then into that mix you then say, okay, would you like to start counselling? And there's at least an 8-week waiting list in that whole process. And so in that swirl of it, what we found was it was a bit like taking a bottle of Coke and shaking it up and then taking the lid off and then wondering why people exploded in the whole process. And yes, people do present with a whole load of symptoms whilst they're in our services. But what we've done is that actually what needs to happen is this shift between a decision about someone, are they or are they not a victim of this crime, and long-term care and that move from victim to survivor to resilient individual. The counselling needs to come later because we're basically stabilising. And I think what you see with the frontline service providers is they really are an A&E service. They're a triage. They're stabilising that process. And actually a lot of our focus is around the legal and recourse to justice.
I think, Andrew, actually that leads ideally into our next question. So maybe the three of you could go into more depth about what policy programs and treatments do you think are needed? And Andrew, you've already said, about even the people coming into the system and how they get their counseling and so on. So let's go to Eileen. What do you think
I think I suppose we've what can be very difficult for victims is to get a treatment that we think has a reasonable chance of working. There's not a strong emphasis on providing, say, an evidence-based psychological treatment for this group, and I think I think an important question is about readiness and when people are ready for a certain type of intervention. But I think certainly in terms of mental health treatment, a lot of people can be provided with something that doesn't end up meeting their needs, and people are often not linked into services that they're entitled to, and there can be perhaps sometimes confusion in statutory services about what people are entitled to if they don't yet have their immigration status. And I think sometimes there can be ideas that if your psychological distress is linked to very clear events, then it's not quite a mental health problem in the way that it might be for a different person. So certainly I've read some reports where they say, oh yeah, this person is very depressed, and they say, well, no, they can't be depressed because actually their life is very hard, so of course they're just reacting normally to their life being very hard. And a very sort of biological view of a mental health problem that doesn't pay attention to the fact that of course our lives are the things that affect how we think and how we feel. So I think probably my key thing would be a push towards more opportunities for people to have evidence-based therapy.
Right, and this, just to make a point about victim services, as in the 18 years I've been working with homicide survivors and organizations, we have the similar problem. Mm-hmm. If they come in after the homicide, they're not usually ready for counseling, but they are, as Andrew points out, it's a holding place for them. There's all sorts of confusion, there's stabilizing, there's all that. And then out of that will come the psychological services, but it's so chaotic. And the services aren't integrated that so many people fall through the cracks anyway, at least in homicide. And I can imagine that's even more so in modern slavery. But thank you. Would you like to say something, then Andrew, make a point?
Obviously, there's a lot of areas of policy that we sort of look into, but particularly I think there's long-term support, and as we're talking about sort of both the mental health aspect, but also the accommodation. We really think when someone leaves a safe house, there should being recognised as a victim of trafficking within the government's NRM should mean something. I think that's the biggest overall statement I think to make, and I think what that should mean is at least have a year in the UK. For recovery, because as Andrew was saying, we hear that we can take up to sort of 2 years sometimes for actually a victim to fully disclose what's happened to them. Because as Ali was saying, people to actually survive it, they have to hide the memories. And we know that's the case with sort of British victims, let alone migrant victims. So if it's kicking them out of the country after sort of half a year, there's no recovery period at all. So I think sort of giving that long-term support, that's the biggest sort of policy, and while that isn't the case, as I was saying, it's working together. So if anyone is based in London and is interested in this area, we are trying to connect the dots and bring people together to try and create some sort of pathway at the moment in London in terms of housing, in terms of mental health support, in terms of legal assistance, in terms of long-term working prospects and training. So if anyone can help or knows anyone who can help, please get in touch with us about that.
Great, thank you. Did you want to make a final comment on that question, Andrew, before we move on?
Yeah, in terms of sort of other problems they face as well, and I think Tamara highlighted it in one of the slides in her deck, which is, what happens to people post this? A lot of them go into the asylum process. And so what we're doing is we're perpetuating life in limbo. And, one of the things I struggle with is the ongoing victimization of these individuals. And so most people, the reason that they got into this was through deception, but one of the main drivers was economic, and they want to work and everything else. And then we stop that ability, or the government stops that ability. They can't work whilst they're in the NRM process. If they go into the asylum process, they can't work. They're unsure whether they've got leave to remain in this country. So all of this just adds to the heightened levels of anxiety. The other thing is also our perception of these individuals, and we've seen everybody through our services, from people with MBAs to somebody that didn't even know which country they were in, and when presented with a mobile phone had no idea what it was. So that shows you the individuality of victims that you're dealing with. So this isn't, the mistake is, let's just find a cookie cutter program for this. And we've actually got to move on from that and say, actually, we need to work with individuals. And for some people, counselling it's a Western construct, and it doesn't work with some people. It's just like, you want me to talk about what I'm feeling, it's just like, hello, one-on-one is now making 700. That doesn't work. So I think we've got to sort of, it's got to be multi-agency. What Tamara and HTF are doing in London, bringing all these agencies together and saying, let's develop this wraparound care. So we've got somebody coming into it, and there are always multiple options for them to pursue. But the driver has got to be, how do we take them from victim to resilient? Because if we don't, we're just going to see people going round and round and round. And that's just a damning indictment on our society. It's not on them. It's not their fault that if they're a victim and they're vulnerable and they remain vulnerable because of the circumstances, that they then get preyed upon.
Good point. And integrated services is the key. And as in every other thing, it seems to be what's lacking is an integrated, holistic approach. But thank you for that. We'll move on to the last questions and then to the questions from everyone out there. What are the symptoms, and this may help us as clinicians to sort of recognize this, and I know it's been on the slides already, but what are the symptoms that may indicate a person has had the experience? What should mental health practitioners be aware of?
Well, I think probably one of the key things for me is perhaps a sense of fear, perhaps a lack of trust. Perhaps if somebody has very great difficulties in disclosing their experiences, or perhaps if you suspect that something has happened, but it's not all quite adding up, that maybe there's some missing information in terms of what a person has been through and is presenting with. I think that a lot of the sort of indicators of somebody being controlled at the moment are very, very important to watch out for. And I know that there was certainly some research done a few years ago in sexual health clinics in London, where it was found that a lot of people were presenting at sexual health clinics with their trafficker and having screenings and having treatment, and it not being identified that they were under control at that moment. And that was it's a potential opportunity for healthcare professionals or social care professionals to intervene. I think people being very isolated is a very important thing and makes people very vulnerable. Some of the people that we work with have a sort of a kind of oscillating thing with relationships where perhaps they might find it very hard to trust people, but maybe then trust some people a bit too quickly, where we think that could place them at risk. And I think probably one of the most important things for me from a safeguarding point of view is how well able are the people that we're working with to identify risk, to assess their own level of safety and to do something about it if they are potentially in a dangerous situation. And I think that's where, if we're working alongside somebody, we have an opportunity perhaps to review that from week to week or from session to session, to be, I think, constantly curious about a person's daily life and how they're managing things, and what do they know what to do if they're at risk.
Very good.
I mean, I think also it's the always being aware that there's no such thing as the perfect victim, and you have an idea, yes, of this kind of terrified, delicate woman kind of thing. But I remember a police officer telling us that they sort of, when they arrested two West African women who'd been victims of trafficking, they were biting and scratching, and they're not necessarily sort of delicate flowers. They're actually people who are very traumatized. And again, with sort of children, some of the girls, obviously in the Rochdale case, they were dismissed by councils as being these difficult, loud, mouthy girls. So some of the children are almost overconfident. So it's almost the other way. So I think it's really about having a very broad mind and really sort of realizing you don't actually know what a vulnerable person necessarily is, and therefore being really open to anything, and understanding that anyone, as Andrew said, from an MBA to someone not recognising a phone is potentially a victim of trafficking. So I think it's just having that awareness at all times, actually, even when it doesn't quite fit what you think. Pretty good one.
I mean, just to recap, and just so we can just drum it home, because hopefully you walk out here recognising it more. But there's things like physical appearance. Literally physical abuse, psychological abuse, malnourishment, unkept, withdrawn, neglected, those kind of things. And often it's just a gut thing. You're going like, something's not right here. And it's just getting over that sort of very British, oh, should I say something or should I do something about it? Is yes, you should. Isolated and just not having freedom of movement around that. But again, we've seen the converse as well. People being totally free to move and just controlled by a mobile phone. Poor living conditions. And Tamara said it earlier in terms of hazards of multiple occupancy. I mean, I wish it was 12 in a 3-bed. It's often way more than that. We talk about hot desking, in the workplace. Well, actually, now in the trafficking space, we talk about hot bedding. I mean, literally, you get 6 hours on a mattress and then you're off because the next person's coming in, just because you've got to extract as much profit from your business model. Unusual travel times, things like that. But victims don't self-identify, and they're really reluctant to see help. And there are very few cases where somebody will go, I'm a victim of trafficking, can you get me out of this situation? They are increasing, and that's with awareness. And I think if you start seeing those things, I mean, my encouragement would be to call the helpline. You've got expert call handlers there that can give advice or signpost, or if you've got somebody with you, we can then access them fast track into either police support or services around that. And they're used to it because they're day in, day out going, okay, are you seeing this, this and this, or can you ask them about this? And then on the other side, in terms of symptoms for victims, I just asked my frontline colleagues, I said, what are the top things that you see in terms of sort of the mental health issues that you're dealing with in the triage situation in terms of the NRM contract? Panic attacks, anxiety, depression, bereavement, loss, obsessive compulsive disorder, sleep difficulties, night terrors, insomnia, especially in sexual exploitation. I mean, their sleep cycles all out of whack. Complex trauma, personality disorders, PTSD, including flashbacks, anxiety, social anxiety, really low self-esteem, disordered eating. That's what my colleagues deal with day in, day out, with the result of slavery. That's what happens to an individual.
It's incredible, when you think about the scope of this and the numbers. According to this article, that it says 3,266 people alone just in 2015. So, and that's as many as you know about. There's probably many, many more. And to think, I think as clinicians, we're not actually aware of this. And so therefore I think awareness is key to even beginning the treatment of people whom we might see. So it's just a staggering problem to think about this. I'd like to open it up for questions, because I'm sure, there's been so much good information here. We're only really at the beginning. You all know of obviously a lot more than we do, but can we have questions for the panel? Yes.
Thank you so much, Julie. So I'm a survivor of domestic violence back in the States, so I've had the great misfortune of having to navigate that process. It's so challenging, even with the restraining order in place, and I'm curious, if you guys had the legal support that you needed, what would that even look like?
Within the Modern Slavery Act, there's a trafficking prevention order that can be put on an individual, and they are starting to be used by the police more and more in that whole process. The truth is, traffickers are highly adaptable beasts, and if you lose one commodity, this is where it deviates from domestic abuse. If you lose one commodity, you're just going to get another one. It's just like, and you'll adapt your model so you just avoid detection around that. That said, with kids, that they're highly prized assets because they can generate the most money, and you've got a really long. A, you've got much more easier control. B, certainly around kids and sexual exploitation, it's far more profitable. And C, we've seen traffickers try to reconnect with the kids, but we've also seen kids, and this is the huge problem. It's certainly amongst migrant children that are found in trafficking situations in the UK, we lose 60 to 80% of them within the first 72 hours. And they go straight back to the traffickers, and they'll just get moved to a different part of the UK, and then the exploitation starts over again. That said, if you manage to get through that golden 72-hour period, trafficked kids can go back to their traffickers 6 months, 1 year, 2 years later, because the bonds, whatever they are so strong. And often those bonds are fear-related, because there will be threats against family at home.
Sorry, why are you associating it to the bonds rather than your failure as an organization to establish some sort of aftercare services for them? And that's why they're going back to the...
Well, that's why we're starting our children's service. So our argument is if you have specialist support and accommodation services combined, and we've got the Home Office partly funding this and also researching this. The Home Office recognises this, it's recognised in the space. With kids, the golden 72-hour period is absolutely critical. They're in a flight mode the whole time. You're a kid, you've been in a trafficking situation, you are consistently told by your trafficker, if you speak out, if you leave, if you do anything else, your parents, your other family members will be killed. Whether or not that is true is immaterial. The child believes it. And the trafficker will show them up-to-date photos, because they control the network in that whole process. So that child believes it. Now, currently they're identified. If they get it, well, hardly any are identified. Thankfully the numbers are starting to go up. But they're then not put into specialist accommodation and support services. They just go into children's services or foster care. And often, historically, there's been no alerting to the situation that this is a trafficked child, therefore these things apply. Add on top of that the complete misuse of the Child's Act, the Children's Act as well. So we don't. I always get the numbers wrong. We don't section 47 or 17. I'm never sure which end it is. These are high-risk kids, and therefore we should use every tool in the box to look after them. And it is literally stabilise them in that first 72 hours. That they're not in trouble, that their families are going to be all right, that they're going to be all right, the trafficker isn't going to find them. But I could give you case study after case study of traffickers knowing exactly which foster family they're with or which children's home they're in. They often use children's homes as holding centres and then get them out when they want them. So that's what you're dealing with. And yeah, I agree with you. We've got to step up our support services in that whole process. And we're seeing whether we can address that golden 72 hours and address the long-term support needs of those kids. But at the moment, we're failing kids. And if I tell you the UK is probably at the forefront of trying to deal with this, I mean, I've been around the globe, and you know, we can beat ourselves up in the UK, but let's put it in a global context. You know, we're bad, but we're not as bad as some of others. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, NGOs have to try and find funding. Really, it's for the government. You know, so Unseen's going to be doing this brilliant project. But I mean, I imagine it's a real effort to try and get that whole thing organised. And but I mean, a little bit of good news is that so part of the Modern Slavery Act does include child advocates. So all children should, at the moment they're still piloting it and then repiloting it. But the plan is for all children, trafficked children, to have an advocate. So that's someone who really is meant, you know, defends their rights and supposedly puts their rights first. So that's a piece of good news. There's also quite, in terms of adults, there's quite a lot of pressure at the moment. There's a committee, Work and Pensions Committee report that came out just a couple of days ago, which is linked to this article, which has basically said, yeah, adult victims of trafficking need at least a year when they leave a safe house, and they need basically on case-by-case support dependent on each individual. It really shouldn't be a sort of kind of basic service for everyone. Each person has different needs, and so it has the report can be found online. It has all the right kind of recommendations. So we're going in the right direction, and there are things that are already happening and or being piloted that are going in the right direction. So it's a bit of good news, maybe.
Sorry, I quite appreciate that. I quite like listening to this really. That it seems to me like you acknowledge the fact that these perpetrators of this crime are allowed to basically walk scot-free and continue what they're doing, because it seems like you feel overpowered by such institutions, and as an organization you have minimal resources to kind of tackle the underlying problem. My point is prevention will be a rather better cure than tackling the problem, and you're not doing much about prevention, if you ask me.
I mean, because obviously, I mean, Helen Bamber, for example, I mean, they deal, their support services are for victims of trafficking, and there are lots of NGOs doing work around prevention, but at the same time, awareness, like for example, there's a lot of work done around awareness raising, but actually that has, I mean, I remember Andrew saying the other day, but I mean, there's a lot of evidence that there's a huge amount of awareness raising in Eastern Europe, and I've sort of seen it myself in case studies that the Human Trafficking Foundation works in Romania and places, and the people, they're brought up, a lot of the children now are brought up being warned about human trafficking, about the types of cases, but if you have absolutely nothing and you see no future for yourself, for whatever complex reasons, it might be to do with poverty, it might be to do with domestic violence, you're going to take those risks. The real answer is solving all these bigger issues around gender, around poverty. They're huge problems to solve. So yes, I think that work can be done around prevention, and certainly, I mean, Andrew was saying in terms of us, you know, thinking about if we go to a cheap restaurant. Well, if I'm paying £6 for a meal, someone's being exploited somewhere in that chain, sort of thing. So so in terms of prevention, it's also about all of our own actions as well. But yeah, I mean, broadly, the bigger solutions are huge, but again, sort of the NGOs here are kind of, we're all trying to pick up the pieces, really.
And I think that there's that there've been various efforts to flag up perhaps roles that the authorities could take on a bit more actively. Like, I know that there's been a lot of criticism in the past of the Border Authority for not providing domestic maids with information about their rights on their arrival to the UK, and that is something that there's been much more focus on in recent years, to ensure that people perhaps who are coming into a job where there's a potential for exploitation at least have access to information, so that they perhaps have an opportunity to go for help should they feel able to do that. I think it's a very small thing given all of the prevention that we might need to do worldwide, but there are certainly, I think there's a lot of potential for improvement in within the authorities here.
Well, I just wanted to add to what Eileen is saying. I work with Eileen, we work with a lot of victims of trafficking, and it relates to what you were saying, in terms of prevention, one of the most important things is to make sure that people are safe until they can manage to go through the incredibly difficult process of speaking to the police. Because one of the reasons that you get that shrug-off mentality from traffickers is that they're not seeing enough convictions and they're not seeing enough punishment for the crime of trafficking. So the whole thing is a bit of a chicken and egg. And when it comes to safeguarding people, I find that adult victims are at risk of either their original traffickers in some cases, although not the majority, but in all cases they're at risk of further exploitation and harm from other perpetrators because they're already had what Eileen's always teaching us about, the psychological impact of trafficking. And so really they have to be kept safe from a number of really violent relationships, and that's why we have an ongoing trafficking care program to make sure that nobody disappears while they're on waiting lists for things. But I do think the relationship between people being able to witness and being cared for and protected are completely connected, and that's where prevention has to begin as well. When somebody stands up and gets a trafficker prosecuted and put away, that's a message to a lot of other people. It's a message to other victims that they can come forward safely, and it's a message to traffickers that this isn't a crime that we're going to tolerate.
And I'd like to add, just from a criminal justice background, that it is because it's not seen in the collective consciousness as a crime. It's this abstract thing. Therefore, the penalties, people don't think in terms of penalties or stopping it. You might say, oh, we need to stop that. But until it's seen as the serious crime it is, I think that psychologically we have a problem dealing with it. And that's why awareness. And just add, I was talking to someone who said, well, look, it's a $6 billion industry. So there's $6 billion not to stop.
If only it was 6
Yeah, in the state, it's some
in
the
States,
figure, right?
Well, I mean, globally,
Yeah.
it's worth $150 billion
Okay.
profit per
Right.
annum,
Right.
and that's a conservative figure. You might as well double that. I mean, to come back, I'm going to stick up for the police, and again, context as well. So the Modern Slavery Act came into effect at the end of 2015. The provision sort of rolled out through the end of 2015 around that. It is now recognised as a serious crime within the United Kingdom, so the tariff is all the way up to life. It's also a lifestyle crime, so all assets can be stripped from that. I was at a policing conference last weekend, with National Policing Lead on it, Crown Prosecution Service, police forces from up and down the UK, and we work closely with police forces as Unseen and through the helpline as well. There is a growing commitment by the police to tackle this crime, but there's also a recognition that it's a really complex crime because victims are really afraid to engage for a whole number of reasons, not just the trauma reasons as well, but they also potentially come from countries where police are complicit in the trafficking as well. So there's so many hurdles to get over. So there is now a huge focus on the police of saying, how do we move to victimless prosecution? What is the evidence that we need to gather as police forces so that we can prosecute these people? But what they're dealing with is a very new way of criminals acting. So this is not the same as drugs. We have a very hierarchical structure, and police, you can leave coke where it is, and you can track that coke whilst you're trying to work your way up the criminal chain to catch the big guys. The moment you have a human being involved, you've got a safeguarding issue, and so you can't just leave that person in a situation. Although we do welfare visits with the police all the time, and we would between us go, in front of us, here's a potential victim of trafficking. Do you want to come with us to a safe house or somewhere safe and everything else? No, I don't want to. Now, what do you do in that situation? If it's a child, you can. If it's an adult, what do you do? Are you going to arrest them so you can forcibly remove them and then compound the trauma and the issues around that? And sometimes you have to walk away from situations, giving them signposts when they're ready to get out of that situation. So back to sort of the models that we're now seeing in terms of criminal activity. It's a completely flat structure. It's peer-to-peer networking, and it's peer-to-peer networking of criminal entities around the globe. And so trying to get to, who are the criminal masterminds in all of this is incredibly difficult. And it is a whack-a-mole thing.
Right. But I think that, again, is where the penalties may be in place, but the public consciousness is not. And I think that's where the activity needs to happen, along with everything else. But if the public is made more aware and starts actively pursuing it, reporting to the helpline, that may help a little bit. But like you said, Andrew, it's you get one group and another pops up. I mean, this is clearly a big problem. But anyway, we have just time for one more question. Did somebody have their hand? Yes.
Thank you. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work mostly with adolescents, but I also work with the Migrant Legal Project, based in Bristol and Plymouth and Cardiff. So, and particularly see young people through that service. I think, and I've recently come out of the NHS 3 years ago, but have a long history working within the NHS, within children's mental health services. I just wanted to echo the point about raising awareness, but also professional and institutional ignorance and determined blindness to recognise the scope and the breadth of these issues. So I very much echo also the points about Rochdale. I had, and the perceptions of children particularly who are being trafficked or exploited, and the lack of recognition. One of the particular reasons for leaving the NHS was when a colleague of mine in Bristol commented on a group of girls who were within a particular children's home in Bristol, that their behaviour was a lifestyle choice. They were putting themselves at risk. That children's home was being used as a base for exploitation, and it was organised, and it's this is hidden in plain sight. But when a colleague, a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist, commented that this was this was young people making lifestyle choices, it gave me such an appalling sense of this is what's happened to professional people, that they're not able to see this. And it's kind of like 30 years ago when I was training in child psychiatry, where there were conferences about how to recognise patterns of child sexual abuse. And when I saw a 9-year-old who had obsessive compulsive behaviour, and I said to the consultant I was working for, this looks like abuse, doesn't it? And she said, no, it's obsessive compulsive disorder. And anyway, so that was a long question. The question is, or partly related to the ideas from the panel about collaboration and about raising awareness, but education of the institutions and the organisations on a large scale, because I think that's what needs to happen.
Would you like to answer that tomorrow from a policy standpoint?
I mean, part of it is just about training. At the moment, I know they're doing a pilot in London that's hoping to be spread, which is being led by the NHS Police and ADAS, which is the Adult Safeguarding. They are doing a train the trainer training for all boroughs in London with the NHS, the police and local authorities. And it really is about just getting them to understand, because I think if you go through some of this stuff with people, actually, I think with Rochdale, it really is, I think people, there's a lot of, I'm sure it's not, people aren't saying, oh gosh, no, I was right. I think there is an understanding that people got things wrong. So I do think it is about just training and awareness. And with statutory authorities, we certainly think in the police and local authorities, it's likely when the guidelines are published that's going to be sort of something that people have to do. But the NHS obviously doesn't have a duty to notify. But again, I think it's something that we're really pushing. That it should be all statutory authorities should have a basic awareness of serious safeguarding issues. It should be part of their training. And that's one of the issues that social workers isn't part of. That trafficking isn't part of their training at the moment. So to me, a lot of it is about training in terms of that awareness and sensitivities around the issues. But I don't know if you've got other.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Can we have some final comments, Andrew?
I just want to add on that as well. I mean, we're Bristol based, and we have a training contract with NHS England. And we've just looked through the helpline in terms of calls from NHS staff into the helpline, and we see a direct correlation between where you have both awareness and training, the call volume spikes up in that. But you're right, I mean, pretty much every single training session that we do, most people sit in that room and you just see the penny dropping. Once they understand the issues and they understand what's presenting to them, they get it. But at the same time, we do come across all the time that misnomer of it, they've chosen to do this. And you just think, no, people do not choose to do this. You know, I woke up this morning, I thought it'd be a good idea to be abused or to be exploited. And it's kind of like we just sort of ditch our brains in that whole process, because actually it's uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable reality that we're having to deal with, and it's an uncomfortable reality at a professional level, and it's an uncomfortable reality at society level. And this is my concluding thing: is why does slavery exist? Because you and I choose to let it exist through our lifestyle choices, through what we purchase, through not reporting, through not saying things, through looking the other way, and not seeing the victim that is hidden in plain sight. They're not hidden away. I mean, the ones that are domestic servitude, and they're the hardest to find, but the vast majority you can see and observe every single day. And it's, part of the good awareness raising to the public is taking the blinkers off and then saying, when you see it, report it, say something, call the helpline, call policing, say something to somebody. It doesn't matter if you got it wrong, because actually, if you get it right, your call might be the final piece in the jigsaw that allows the police to operate, or it might be the ticket that gets somebody out of the situation of serious exploitation.
Thank you.
I suppose just in terms of anyone who's a mental health professional or any type of health professional or social care professional, there might not be the same duty to report within the NHS, but there certainly is a duty to do a full safeguarding assessment and risk assessment. And I think all of the indicators in terms of somebody's life, in terms of how somebody is managing, should be something that we're trying to attend to in any assessment of safeguarding, which, if the person is in a position to disclose, should provide an opportunity for us to be able to recognise that they have this particular problem and particular needs that come from that.
Thank you. Tamara?
And I would just say, when you go back to your offices, think about what your office or department can be doing. Maybe send them all around. You can find videos online. Unchosen are a great organisation that do amazing, powerful videos about human trafficking. Maybe send them around. Maybe see if you can set up some sort of referral system, as I said, in terms of maybe working with survivors who are coming out of safe houses, or even within safe houses, and see what mental health, maybe specialist provision, maybe your departments might be able to provide for victims, and start looking at sort of maybe what protocols and pathways you can maybe set up in your departments. So, be the champion where you're working about this, and I think sort of that if you will do that will be a huge first step.
On that note, and that's a good note, is that we can all affect change. And I want to thank our guest today, because you really have a wealth of information about this thing that we don't think enough about. We might hear about it, but we don't know what to do. And now we've been given some tools. So I thank you, and please stay around to talk to the panelists afterwards, and thank you for coming.